Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to Beyond the Bank. I'm Sandra Henderson, one of the co-founders of Delisle Advisory Group, and it is my pleasure today to host a fabulous guest, someone that I've been looking forward to having this conversation with for a while. So, Mike Moodie. Mike Moodie and I go back a number of years, and I'm going to let Mike tell his story because it's a great one. But currently now the head and a senior partner running Stonehage Fleming, a family office, a global family office. And we'll probably end on that note at the end of this conversation about why a family office like what Mike's so engaged with is so critical in today's environment. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Mike, what I think is so important for everyone
Thanks.
to understand is how you came through this years of your journey and where you've been and what led you to today. But why don't I just hand it over to you and welcome again. And thank you for doing this.
Sandra, it's my pleasure. It's great to be with you, and I appreciate Delisle doing this. Yeah, I mean, 40 years ago, when I started this journey, never did I think I would be ending up on a podcast and talking with a good friend about a 40-year journey that had 5 countries in it and a wealth career. And it's funny how things go. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was 1985, first-year university student. As many back then did, banks, trust companies had extended hours. You were getting in some time, being a teller, learning the biz. And I was like many others at that time. It was a job, it was interesting. And suddenly, upon graduation, turned into a career. The trust companies and the banks provided a wonderful opportunity for graduating students to learn about finance. If you were in the trust company side, there was, estate planning, there was investment management for estates, those kinds of things. And it was exciting times as well, because that was sort of the Canadian banking industry. Broker-dealer businesses, insurance businesses, trust companies, banks were sort of consolidating.
So
And
much going
so,
on, right?
yeah, there was a lot of things happening
Yeah.
back then. And I had a 10-year career in the retail wealth side of things. And by the mid 90s, I was at Royal Trust. We were acquired by Royal Bank. It was a fabulous acquisition. And the new CEO of Royal Trust came from the bank, a gentleman by the name of Tony Webb. And Tony had been the international head
Right.
for Royal Bank. And I got a call the mid 90s saying, Mike, thinking about career, might you be interested in coming to Toronto? We have an opening. There's team leader to join our what we called global private banking,
Yeah.
and that you would be working with some accountants, some former lawyers, other specialized staff across Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. And you'll help Canadian families use this international network that we have. And I remember coming home and saying to my wife, Kim, hey, I've got an opportunity. It sounds great. I know nothing about it. I mean, going to Toronto was international from Ottawa, and this idea of, why do families in Canada do stuff internationally? And, why Bermuda? Why Bahamas, Cayman, Barbados, Jersey, Guernsey, London,
Yeah.
Switzerland? Like why? And so we did. And little did we know that move in the mid 90s to start on the international would lead to 20 years of international wealth management, leading businesses in the Caribbean, the US, Latin America, and the UK, and then subsequently, the last 8 years with a multifamily office, internationally focused. I had no clue that was in store.
Our
And
past
that
name.
trip, exactly, Sandra, and that trip to Toronto and starting to work with families really opened my eyes. And, you know, 3 years in Toronto of working with families and starting to understand, an opportunity came about to actually move to Barbados. And this was the start of a 4 country journey: Barbados, Bahamas, Miami, and then on to London, UK. And, if you're the one that the job is rotating around and you're making the move, it's very exciting. You're meeting new
Yeah.
colleagues, you're meeting new businesses, new clients, etc. But it's a big ask of your family. I had, my wife, I remember just moving to Toronto, you're giving up your job in Ottawa, your kids' daycare, you're moving, and suddenly you're going through these countries. And, we didn't know that the ultimate plan was 16 years abroad, but thankfully, and it's not for everyone, but we did have really good run for our kids getting an experience of different cultures, the Caribbean, the US, and then ultimately into the UK. But I can tell you, it can get confusing. I know you've moved families, and
Done it many
you've
times.
had you've had that thing. And I'll never forget. We had been in the US roughly 8 years, and we were moving to London. I was going to be the CEO of the UK wealth business for one of the banks. And we took the kids across, and we were in Europe, and my son was really wrestling. He was 8 years old, wrestling with this issue of, why are we moving to the UK?
Yeah.
And he said, I'm an American, and I want to stay in Miami. And we sort of looked at my wife. I looked at our son at the time and said, well, actually, you're a Barbadian who has a Canadian passport, a green card, and now you're going to be UK res non-dom. And so technically, it becomes very confusing. But for families that are starting to move about globally, these are the kinds of issues that you start to deal with, right? And when I began the business, I had no understanding of how people get connected globally. Yeah. And then a few years in and moving around, you start to realize that. And I think for families that are considering an international posting, it's not for everyone. But if you're up for a little adventure, you enjoy learning new culture, you enjoy doing things. It wasn't obvious at the start, but I think at the finish, Sandra, I think our kids, our wife and I, we look back on it as saying, oh my God, we traded sort of a home base for a group of pieces of puzzles along the way. And it taught the kids a lot around sort of resilience and reinventing themselves. So anyways, that was sort of the backdrop, if you will, of the career of moving through various wealth management. So that gave me experience with sort of Canadians, Americans, Caribbean, Latin America, and then over to...
So a great background, Mike, for what you do today, discussing with families who have multi-jurisdictional ideas, property, family, etc. So yeah, you've lived it. You've been there. You've seen what it can, the pros and the cons of the moves on family, and also the complexities that can arise just being in different jurisdictions.
Listen, very, very much so. And sort of going back then to the business side and saying, okay, so why do families have these international needs or connections or things? And it wasn't obvious to me when I moved to Toronto in that first move to work with, clients that had this. And suddenly you realize, and it makes obvious sense, families have arrived in Canada. They have family members abroad. Canada's a very welcoming country, people coming from all over. So you've got wealth tied to different generations in different parts of the world. You have people having various citizenships and reporting obligations and things that are going on around their wealth domestically and intergenerationally. Business reasons is a huge reason why particular families make moves. They could be around hobbies. They, enjoy sailing. They want to spend time in the Caribbean. Assets, real estate, you name it, Sandra. And I think it wasn't obvious to me at first, but after that, you start to realize that, oh my God, there's Canadians everywhere. And I heard a stat, there's something like 800,000 of them in the US, for example. And you think about the ties around, what does that mean for people that are working and advising families to be aware of? The things that, I quickly learned was that families, as their profile crosses borders, need to assemble teams, and they have very, very trusted advisors domestically that have been there for them, that they value, want to work with. And suddenly you need to sort of add on for project work or ongoing work, new advisors, and create teams to do a project, to do ongoing work. You're dealing with different laws, perhaps going from a common law to a civil law jurisdiction. It can be very confusing for the family and even for some of the advisors. I remember, Sandra, there was when I returned from the UK in 2015. I come back to Oakville. We've been gone 16 years and went golfing with a new neighbor. And we were there, and the starter said, "Listen, do you mind if we add this gentleman to your group?"
Okay.
Problem. And this gentleman joins us. We start playing, and of course, you're making conversation.
Yeah.
Have you, do you live in Oakville? And he says, "Yeah." He said, "But I just sold my house on the lake." And so I'm thinking, okay, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Right? Play a hole and say,
Yeah.
and where are you moving to? And he said, "Florida." And I said, "Wow, Florida." I said, "I used to live 8 years in Florida." And I said, "I'm a bit of a cross-border geek. I spent 30 years with a bank doing, 20 years of cross-border. I lived there." How do you find the move? Like your departure planning, your arrival planning.
What's that going to look like?
And Sandra said, "What do you mean?" He goes, I have a business in Toronto.
Yeah.
My son's doing a golf scholarship.
Down
And in Florida, and my wife and I and young daughter want to be there. But I'm not trying to steal a job. I'm still doing my Canadian thing. And, I said, I'm not a tax lawyer, not a tax accountant, don't play one on TV. But I've worked with this, I've lived this. You really need to actually speak to a Canadian tax professional and a US tax professional. And I said, "I'm not trying to embarrass you, but you need to understand there's
complexities of this." Yeah.
the complexities of this." Set him up with counsel on both sides.
Yeah.
About a week later, called, said, "Let's go for dinner." And he said, "Mike, I can't thank you enough." He goes, "I just sold my house and I can't move to the US right now." And, Sandra, that's sort of the essence of this, that a lot of this cross-border work requires educating families before they do something.
That's the case.
And forming teams and figuring out, okay, who knows what out there that can help guide this person. In his case, we became good friends. He's obviously, became a client.
Yeah.
Over time, but he's not alone. And I don't share that as an embarrassing story. I share that as more of a story. People don't know what they don't know.
Well, and as we know, the world has become smaller by the way of things, of technology, et cetera. And we hear of, family members, kids going to the US to go to school. And next thing you know, they meet the love of their life and they now are going to stay in the US. And then, all of the planning that we perhaps would have thought would have been sufficient in Canada is thrown out the window because of something just that naturally happens. Whether it planned or not planned, life happens, right? Exactly. So that's a great discussion around, Mike, for someone like yourself who you can see it and find it. How do you think that education component can be more, I don't know, bring more Canadians to the conversation, if you will? How do you bring the focus there so that everybody understands that there's reasons why there's some planning aspects that are required?
You know what? I think today, it's interesting. I think there's a lot more of this. There's more podcasts, there's more content pieces. I think people are into storytelling a lot better these days. And I think the opportunity to get messages out there for people that, if you're thinking of this, this is something that's important to you and your family. We need to build a team. We need to get the right advice around that, right? And so I do think the conversation is getting bigger in that regard, Sandra. I do.
Great. When you think about moving now to Stonehenge, and when you think about, maybe you can give us a little bit of background of Stonehenge. I can tell the story, but I'd love for you to do that. And coming from a bank to a global family office, what are some of the differences that you've seen right from the outset?
Great questions. Interestingly enough, in my 5 years in the UK as the CEO for a wealth management business at one of the banks, you know, what better way to get connected with sort of the leading multifamily office in Europe, Middle East, Africa, than to rent a house from the chairman and the CEO
Remember this?
unexpectedly. And so I met this firm, Stonehage Fleming, upon my arrival, and this was just after the liquidity crisis of 2010. And when I arrived, my landlord was very gracious. We got talking, but he was very keen on the fact that Canadian banks, post the liquidity crisis of 2010, were in vogue. And RBC happened to have the wealth platform, the only one of the big banks in London. And so it was, our clients they need banks in their lives, but we're managing counterparties at the moment and in 2010, and that proved very opportune to go in and talk to the people at Stonehage Fleming. Excuse me. I hadn't really seen much in the way of multifamily offices at that time. My time in Latin America, there were many families that formed around family offices.
Yeah, there are.
And my time subsequent in the UK, seeing a lot of single family offices. And I know now in North America, there's a lot of single family offices that have set themselves up. Stonehage Fleming, an interesting story. We're about 1,000 staff across 19 offices in 14 countries, heavily weighted to Europe, Middle East, Africa. The origins of the firm, if you're a James Bond fan, the whole Fleming family, the seventh generation Robert Fleming family, who set out a business that did a lot of work in the UK, in Africa, in parts of Europe, in corporate finance, private markets.
Right.
And the Flemings had sold a business to what today would be JP Morgan back in 2002. Recreated, there's 200 Fleming family members, the descendants of Ian and the whole James Bond and others. And they created a multifamily office that said, what are we good at? As a 7th-generation family governance and succession, something we are. We're a very big art family. So, let's do some art advisory. We're good at private markets, that type of thing. And they found a firm called Stonehage. And Stonehage started in the late 1970s, and it was some very significant families out of South Africa that were really challenged with the apartheid issues that were going on. And at that particular point, I turned to a couple of advisors and said, help us move. And what does that mean? Where immigration issues, company issues, property ownership issues, you rank them down, and suddenly you realize that you have to build teams and infrastructure to help multi-jurisdictional families. Flemings were multi-generational families. And so Stonehage Fleming today, Sandra, ended up as this sort of multi-generational, multi-jurisdictional, multi-family office. We're an a la carte firm. There is no required service. Many of our clients are single family offices, and they have to determine what do they want to hire and staff for themselves, and what do they want to outsource for a project or ongoing. So things they don't know how to do or don't want to do. It might be tax and estate law. And so they might come to us for that, or it might be an art advisory, or it might be something else. And so when I left after 30 years, career in 2015 with RBC and retired, joined Stonehage Fleming, came to Canada. We opened a rep office. I tell you, and I know, we work together a lot.
Thanks.
Idea of family offices, these multifamily offices, they are different than the banks in many ways. Listen, everybody needs the bank in their life. And as a 30-year career banker, I knew and promoted that value props, and the banks do a lot of things well. But some of the things that are different that you find in that space is, the first thing, a firm like ours, the majority of the firm is owned by the partners.
Right.
And we're independent. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the decision making around what's important to our firm and for the families we serve is decided by the group that's working there.
Similar
And that
to our model.
independence,
Yes, independent.
yes, yes,
Yes,
yeah,
it's
at
exactly.
Delisle, yeah.
What's
And
what's
so
good for clients is what steers our ship. Yep.
it's not blended with another division line somewhere else that you're trying to manage a portfolio, right? And so I think, that's one of the things. The second thing is you can get into areas that families need a lot of help with that the bank's platforms just aren't set up for and they don't want to be in. And I'll give you a couple
Yeah.
examples. Family governance and succession. If you think of some of the most highly prized family relationships that any bank would be dealing with at their enterprise level, and you see that there are issues around governance, next gen development, it's highly contentious and very
Yeah.
conflicted to go in and help them resolve. You could end up alienating an older generation, the
Yes.
younger generation,
Boy, yeah.
or you end up alienating both, right? Um, a firm that is hired to come in and just focus on that
Yeah. Help
objectively,
conversations and communication.
help the conversations, etc.
Yeah.
The family offices can do that because the quote unquote, there's nothing to lose. You can have the moral courage. You can go
Right.
in and just say, this is what we see, this is where we help. And I think that's an area that we're starting to see it. Some firms sort of draw on that and realize that banks aren't paid for doing that kind of work.
No.
Global relocation, right? Huge topic right now. We'll talk a little later, I know, in the research
Yeah. I
findings,
think
but
that's great.
global geopolitical, global relocation is everywhere right now as families are not
Yeah.
sure they want to stay where they are, they want to move somewhere else, etc. So imagine this, whether a client comes in, significant family, and sits down, and if they talk to their private banker and said, I think we're done with where we're living here today, whether it's Canada, the UK, the US,
Yeah.
where should we go?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is typically, well, I can't really advise you, but
Where would you
I
like
had
to
some
go?
clients move here, they went to the Caribbean, I had some go here, and they seem happy, right? But I'm not really paid to work
No,
through
give
that.
advice on that. Yeah.
So then they go to their investment advisor and they
Mm.
say to she or he, hey, where should I move to? And again, the same discussion. I've had some clients go
Yeah.
here, go there, and then they go to their tax and estate lawyer. And
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
she or he may say, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I can advise you on your departure obligations and I can tell you where some other clients have gone. So the family's sitting there going, like, who's going to help me examine the jurisdictions and do the homework on this?
Mm.
And where should I go? And that's where the family office, that's where we spend a lot of time right now, Sandra, which is engaged to sit down and
See
say,
that and hear that more often with Canadians recently than I've heard in, I don't know, my
yes,
25, 30 years. People actually considering a move. And it used to be they were always going to the US. I don't know why, but in the past, it was like, oh, we're going to move
yes,
to the US and whether, I don't know, who
yes,
knows? It could be business ideas. It could be, I just hate the weather, whatever the reasons.
yes,
Now, though, it is people looking outside of North America. And that is becoming much more prevalent. And it has a lot to do with, don't go the path, but politics and geopolitical and the economics and the environment of how things are operating.
yes.
But whatever their reasons, it's interesting to me that they don't know anything about the risks and the consequences of leaving Canada first and foremost. And then secondly,
Yes.
the how to structure things if they are going to leave.
Listen, you just put it together. And I think it's in that context that a family office is really hired where a family says they hire people in their own single family
Yeah.
office for things they want to do and they understand.
Yes.
They outsource for things they don't want to do and they don't understand.
Makes sense.
And so that's where sort of our model fits in, is to help these families and these family offices do things that fall outside of where they want to go. And so you then end up working with the families, all their advisors, and say, okay, let's explore why. Now, for me, having lived in all these jurisdictions,
Yes.
it gives some personal insight to what it's like to have a family across these different places. It usually starts with taxation.
Mm-hmm.
I want to pay the least tax.
Canada's one of
And
the
then
highest
it
tax
softens.
jurisdictions.
Exactly. And then it softens because then you start saying, well, is healthcare important? Yes.
Mm,
All right. So do you want to be in this country or that country with healthcare issues? Maybe we can find this is a better country. Now, where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to be doing connecting flights or direct flights?
right.
Maybe I want to do direct flights and I want some health care and I wanted this, right? And you end up finding the right time. And so we have practice areas that focus on that,
Right.
then can come back and sit with the family's advisors and say, okay, so how do we do this? It might not be all the families moving, some of the families moving, some are
Yeah.
staying. So
Right.
what do they need to do? And so, I think that for me, in terms of the family office piece, has been probably one of the more interesting things. And then you're also working perhaps with some jurisdictions that a number of the big banks now,
Don't
have said, we're a north-south strategy, we're over here, but, I've got a family member in Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
And, they have some needs. They want to send some wealth to Canada. They need a structure. And you might find that challenging depending on
Yes.
the model.
Right.
So a little more flexible, a little more independent.
Yeah.
And the good banks right now, and there are people within everywhere, as you and I know, right? That
Great people.
I have this term called co-opetition, that it kind of says, we may compete on a service line in this country, on that thing, etc. But if you have respect, you focus on the family and you back up a bit, then you can say, you know what, we could team together to solve this issue for the family, and everyone's happy, and keep it on the family.
And I think the concept around specialized planning for high net worth and ultra high net worth families, it is complex for every family, and you can't be an expert in every one of those aspects of planning. So I think it's a model where you go to the best in class, the people that you can partner with
Yes.
to bring those ideas and solutions to families. And maybe it's a one-time engagement, but perhaps it's something that goes
True.
on for generations. It's a which leads me to the next piece about the work that you and I did recently was around family education,
Yes.
and how thoughtful I thought Stonehage's approach was to how important it was to educate the next generation, and how we see in
Yes.
planning multiple times when it breaks down is because the communication and the conversations just don't take place. So maybe just lead me down the path a little bit of how did that family
Happy
education
to.
component come
Happy to.
along? Yeah.
So we've been doing some family research, and thank you, Sandra. You're a big supporter of it. And
And
over the last 10 years, as we were doing these, some proprietary research around going to multiple generations of different families in different jurisdictions and asking them a very simple question. What do you see as the key risks to a successful transfer of wealth to the next generation?
Right.
So there's all this talk, right? The $1 trillion of all this money that's
all
going
the
to
money
come.
that's going to transition. Yeah.
That's all going to transition. But what do you think the risks are? And asking different generations and a few of their advisors. So this has been a focus for us. We call it our 4 pillars of capital research. Interestingly, the last report was done last summer, 2023. We went to 300 families around the world, leading families, and asked them this question. The top 3 concerns globally were investment returns. Now, we hadn't seen investment returns pop up in this in 10 years. But last summer in 2023, when the survey was done, interest rates still were rising. Are they going to stop? What's happening? There was a lot of
Yeah.
concern, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, globally investment returns. Failure to appropriately engage the next generation, which had been sort of a hallmark of the
Yeah.
last few reports.
Yeah.
And you touched on it, geopolitical taxation had popped up on the radar, right? And globally they're worried. The North American subset of that, its number one was actually failure to properly engage the next gen, followed by failure to plan, then geopolitical. Investment returns wasn't in the top three in the North American context. And so I think from a headline point of view, for advisors working with families in North America, finding out, asking questions around how's it going with the
Yeah.
development of your plan with your family, with your next gen? And are you talking to the next gen? Are there engagements? Because clearly this is the number one issue.
Yeah.
And it gets referenced in phases like I talk to the next gen all the time. I'm talking to and then you talk to the kids and they say, yeah, just spouting off something that this is happening is not a discussion,
Right. Yes. That's exactly it.
and that's not preparing me. And I'm going to take you through a little bit deeper of some of the
Thank you.
differences globally. But that was a big one. And so I think for advisors, the failure to properly engage and develop, the failure to plan, and this geopolitical taxation concern
Yeah.
out there, if you're asking questions about that in our mind in North America, you're on to probably the right types of issues
You
to
know,
have a
it
deeper discussion.
That's a really interesting thought, Mike. And so you think about those top three, two of them you can do something about, right? You can really be focused.
Yes.
You can help get your family educated. You can go and do that work. So that's who's holding them back. Well, that's you personally. The same thing around failing to plan. Well, that's again back in your lap.
Yes.
And then I guess you can plan around taxation. You can plan and make choices around the geopolitical environment, but less control, right? Less in your day-to-day control. So I'd
And
be
it
curious.
falls into two buckets. Yeah, no. And I tell you, this started about 2 years ago. And I'm based here in Toronto, and there's a Canadian element to this. But I can tell you right now, we just did a webinar, Sandra, 2 months ago, where we had 12 jurisdictions where people were interested in going to, and saying that, can you please tell us more if we
Right.
could become a resident or a citizen. Now, they were the US, they were the UK, they were Canada, now each of those top three, we know there are people leaving
Yeah. Yeah.
and then there are people coming. And people are swapping their concerns and what they believe are their benefits
Yes.
in those countries, and there are elections in those countries,
True.
right?
So
And then
yeah.
whether it's Switzerland or Dubai or Italy or Portugal, Monaco, Malta, we had 12 jurisdictions and talking about the immigration and sort of the
Yeah.
taxation benefits for that. And it was fascinating because you pick up the phone and somebody wants to leave, and you pick up the phone and somebody wants to come. And people are like flying through the
Yeah.
skies in different directions. So geopolitical is a big one, and not everything is an all or nothing, too. I think that's the other takeaway. We've been working with families where there's a part of the family that wants to go.
Oh, that's
Is
interesting too.
it just a residency issue, or is it
Mm.
they want citizenship as well, that they want to go? And so that creates complexity, work for the families around, well, if they leave, what about their next gen, and how are their advisors working? Because if these people take the wealth abroad, it's going to come back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it structured properly to come back to the Canadian beneficiaries?
Mm-hmm.
And so you can tell I'm engaged in this. I'm excited about this.
No, I
Having
mean,
lived
it's
this
such an
for 20
important.
years, every
Yeah,
every
you
client's
get
like a
it.
Rubik's cube. You've
Yeah.
got these moving parts that make it very interesting. and for the, you're constantly creating new teams to help the families out, right? And
Getting
I
the
cover
experts
this.
around the table to actually help and provide some guidance. So when you go back to the survey for the 4 pillars,
Some
I
of the
mean,
other things
yeah,
that
I'm
were
just
there,
curious.
let
Yeah.
me take you through that. So there were some very interesting North American differences to the international results,
Yeah.
the
Okay.
global results,
Yes.
right? So the first one that struck me was, you know, in terms of equipping the next gen for their broad responsibilities of wealth,
Right.
only 17% of North American families said, we trust the family, just the environment, just
Interesting.
only 17%.
Wow.
Globally was almost 50%.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
North American families are not trusting just being a part of the family to get
It's
what you
going to
need to
work out in the long
understand.
run.
North American families are interested in exposing their next gen to getting some education, to getting them experiences, to getting them exposed to global peer groups,
Right.
talking about it more formally.
Yes.
Much more than global and very more progressive in that sense. And so
Okay.
when you think about the rise of next gen training, is it just about financial components or is it about exposing them to other components that
Right.
they might come across around wealth, right? But there's that. And Canadian, it was U.S. and Canada, and we had an equal number of Canadian and U.S. So
Okay.
North America. The other was around in-person meetings and saying how important is it that you meet as a family with NextGen.
Yeah.
And I think it was like 92% of North American families said absolutely we need in-person meetings. Globally, it's 55%. Now, I
Wow.
don't know, and we're trying to reconcile, is that because the families are just so spread out,
So dispersed and
it's
yes.
hard, or is it that the North American families realize that getting together and sitting down face to face
Yeah.
is an important aspect
Hmm.
to work with your next gen,
I
right?
almost would wonder if it has to do with the trust element that you mentioned previously. Is it they don't trust that it's going to
Yeah,
work out for them in the long run? So hence
yeah.
meeting face to face is a better way to ensure that. That's a very interesting stat.
That's it. And then philanthropy. So philanthropy is huge, right? Very
Yes.
important component piece for many families
Bringing them together normally.
that brings them together, etc. And so one of the questions we had was around, how formally do you engage NextGen in your philanthropy? And
Yeah.
over 50% of North American families said, yes, we do. We think it's important.
Okay, good.
Only 30% of global families did. And again, we're trying to sort out that these family offices tend to have a longer history globally.
Yes, yes.
They're more of a newer phenomena here.
Yeah.
So is it that it's just because it's newer and because it's the
Hmm.
practice of excluding next gen from a lot of things, it's
Yeah.
much more inclusive. But if families aren't involving the next gen, the sort of trends against you that more and more families are involving as one of the aspects of what they would want. There was an
Interesting.
interesting one about managing reputational risk. This has become a huge concern for many
Yeah.
families. And we asked, to what extent are you doing some sort of formal process about managing your reputational risk? And North American families said 23% said we have no process,
Hmm.
which flipped on its head meant
Yeah.
that 77% had a informal or formal process. They were taking it quite
Okay.
seriously.
Quite seriously, yeah.
Almost half of global families had no formal process.
All
So
right. Yeah.
interesting that
Yeah.
again there's a very much an interest in what your reputation is. We need to
Yeah.
manage it. You need to get experts around what you're doing. Very quickly, female leadership
Right.
involvement. We asked the question, to what extent do you see it increasing and playing a bigger role in the family offices? North Americans, 83% said absolutely increasing. We see it
Yeah.
being much more. Globally, it was at 62%,
Interesting.
which was interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe,
No,
a little bit
2 out of the 3 of
behind.
our founders are women. So with Jean and I, we're doing a whole new segment also on women and wealth and our experience through the generation. It's an exciting
It
topic and something
it
that
is.
yeah, we won't go down the path yet, but I tell you, more to come on this one. But when I look at the history, it just is shocking to me that the numbers have not changed with the number of women involved in the actual investment process across the globe. It's staggering still.
Well, it needs to improve. And interestingly, in the North American context, at least in the family office space,
Yeah,
within families, they see that happening.
yeah,
And probably an interesting way to sort of narrow it back, Sandra, was that we asked the question about to what extent is your family office involving third parties and sort of openness to
yeah,
involving
Julia,
third
yeah,
parties to help.
right.
67% of North American families, yes, that they actually would now start to consider outsourcing certain aspects to third parties to
Yeah,
bring in professional help
yeah,
on aspects that you need a third base person. Go
yeah.
get a third base person. Get the best one that's out there that fits your needs and bring them in.
And that's the thing when
And
you think about the fact that as families grow and their needs are a little bit different, having people around the table that can spend the time with not
yes,
thousands of clients but just a number of families that you can manage and really go deep on those planning pieces and go through and who is the best in class in global advisory, who's the best in class in this aspect, let's bring these people together. And I love that concept. That to me is, I think, the future of wealth management. It's the boutique element of it.
I agree. And the last thing maybe I could just close on and
Yeah,
welcome your thoughts is that when we look at sort of what the challenge is around next gen, I know you've been a big supporter of next gen and the development of
absolutely.
next gen and,
Yeah.
and, and its big part. We sort of look at leadership in the family and what's required. We call it the four pillars of capital:
Yes.
financial, intellectual, social, cultural.
Mhm.
Leadership is required for all of those,
Yeah.
but it tends to be consolidated on financial capital. All the discussions are
So
about the
true.
financial,
So true.
and that sort of intellectual capital being, what's this family good at? Are they good at entrepreneurialism? Are they good at innovation? Are they good at things? What is it that they're good at? And who is being developed or leading that in the family, right? And figuring that
Yeah.
out. Social, what do you want to be
As a
your
legacy.
connectivity to the community, right? And how does that look? And that was interesting. When in North America, it was one of the stats I didn't. I should have mentioned it earlier, but it really stuck out that North American families wanted to find a good way to share with communities what they're doing to make the community better, whether through
Right.
philanthropy, etc. Globally, it was the exact opposite: be discreet, anonymous,
Yes.
etc. And we see a lot of that with Next Gen saying on social media, you know what? Our family's doing a lot.
Yeah.
Everyone's saying we're not doing our fair share, we're not doing this. And I want to tell people that,
Yeah.
we
The
just did that
benefit.
hospital
Yeah.
wing and we've been doing this. And it's like, no, we don't brag. And it's like, no, it's not bragging. But I want
About
people, this
sharing.
next gen, I want people to understand that we are doing something for society and in a proper way. And the cultural side of that last pillar was sort of the norms and the values of how a family governs
Right.
itself. And if you can, our sort of, we wake up in the morning, we finish the day of sort of, what is the purpose of the wealth for the family?
Right. It's
And if,
amazing to
if
me
you
the
can,
number of clients that haven't had
yes,
the chance maybe to articulate it or the time or even the process to do so. But when you
yes,
actually ask and say, so, what does the money mean to you? And at the end,
yes,
forget about the investment returns and forget about, but like really, what's the purpose of the money? It's amazing discussion. I love that discussion every time because it makes people sit back and think it's not about the material things. And maybe for some families it is, but it really is about creating benefit to family members in their communities in which they live. And they all say it in a different
Yes.
way, but it's they want to leave the place a better
It
place
all
than they found
comes
it. Yeah.
exactly right, and it all comes back to that. So, anyways, but those would be sort of the high level thoughts, and
I love that, Mike. And,
yeah,
I look at the journey you've had. So, firstly, congratulations. It's been an extraordinary many years of, bank and all of those jurisdictions to coming back and really applying all of it to the work that you've built up for so many years. So, and I truly
thank
appreciate
you.
the work that we've done together and hope to continue that in the future. So, Mike, I really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for everything that you've been doing.
Well, Sandra, thank you, and thank you to Lyle as well. I think
Thank
having
you.
watched some of the various podcasts, the areas that you're exploring and bringing insight to your clients and the families that you're working with, I think is fabulous. These are the kinds of conversations, go back where we started earlier on, about
Yeah.
are people making people aware, right?
Yeah.
And helping. So
And that's kind of our thought is just
congratulations
bringing
to you, Delisle.
education and awareness. Anyways, it's been tons of fun. Mike, until next
Thank
time,
you.
thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sandra.
All right.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.